And it is also my pleasure to invite our two speakers and mentors that will guide us through this brain date for the afternoon as well. We have Dayong. Dayong is a partner at Dalberg and also has been a brainstorming partner for us to think through some of the ways in which we look at collective action and measurement of collective action. And we have Kavita ji as well here. She's also an impact measurement specialist and has been a mentor to the Shikshagraha journey almost from its beginning stages as well. And they will help us think through some of ideas, some of the concepts, and some examples that we can think through as well when it comes to collective action and measurement of collective action. Yes, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Firstly, so sorry we ran quite a bit late, but thank you for your patience. Hopefully you enjoyed a long leisurely lunch. My name is Dayong. As Richa mentioned, I am with a company called Dalberg. We are a social impact consultancy that 100% focused on social and environmental impact. A lot of what we do is help guide organization strategy, whether it's an NGO or a philanthropy and so forth. And a lot of my work as a global co-lead of the education to employment practice also is on M&E. So for businesses, you have profits and revenue, which guide the performance of an organization. But as we all know, in the social impact space, it is about measuring your impact, right? And how do you really get precise around that is more, I think, art than science. But there are, of course, some frameworks and tools that over the years as Dalberg have developed to really help your organizations, hopefully, think about this as well. And why measurement for collective impact? Increasingly at Dalberg, we're seeing not just organizations doing work in silos and programmatically, but also in collaboration with others, whether it's NGOs themselves or with funders as well. And so at Dalberg, we've incubated and sort of helped set up some of these collaboratives like the India Climate Collaborative, which is mainly of funders getting together and getting on the same page, to the Education Finance Network, which is a global network to increase the amount and effectiveness of education finance, to LiftEd, which is a consortium focused on foundational literacy and numeracy with some outcomes-based financing element to it. And also been measuring the impact of a few of these collective action initiatives, including one for youth overall well-being in India that I'll talk about later, as well as a micro insurance network that's global and so on. So in this session, we were hoping to share some of our lessons and some frameworks we've developed over time, both on the why and the what to measure when it comes to collective impact and how that's different from kind of impact that one organization is having, and the how.
Thank you, Dayong. Hi, I'm Kavita, and I've been working in the field of impact measurement and management for the last 15 years. And until now, I had been working with AVPN, which is a network of funders and social investors. So one of my tasks there was to measure the impact of networks. So that's why I had to go through a lot of frameworks to understand how do we really measure the impact of networks. It's not a very straightforward way when we think about measuring the impact. When this opportunity came up, we thought Dayong and we could share some of the learnings and the knowledge that we've gained so far with all of you, because as Dayong mentioned, we know that almost all of you are working in some or the other kind of collectives where you form networks with other organizations to achieve the same goal. And then, therefore, how do you then measure, or how do you measure your progress as well, which is very important. So we'll share with you a very easy framework that we came across. There are a lot of technical frameworks as well, and the framework that we're going to share with you today is quite an easy framework where you can situate your organization's work very easily. So it's quite adaptable, not very, very standardized, quite flexible to work with. So we hope that the takeaway for you from this session would be you'll be able to utilize the framework in measuring the impact of your own collectives that you're working in. So, oh, the slides are yet to be on. Yeah, we can do that. By the time they put up the slides, can we have a show of hands on how many people are working in some or the other form of collectives or working with different partners? Oh, almost all. Amazing. And how many of you are from impact measurement backgrounds? You've been working, oh, quite some. So amazing. You don't really require very technical knowledge for this session because, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sharing with you a framework which is quite easy to understand and quite adaptable. And we'll try and help you figure out how you want to measure the impact of your work in a collective. Okay, by the time the slides are going to be up, I would like you to share with us what are the challenges you face in measuring social impact. Forget the measurement of a collective, but even when you're looking at measuring the impact of your work as an organization, what are the challenges that you face?
So I think that deserves a session of its own. But I think to start off with, like just the articulation of goals and outcomes across different kinds of stakeholders is a big challenge. So your field teams would say something else, your leadership would say something else. And what flows from that is also the metrics. What are you tracking over time? So I think really defining metrics and then having your short, medium, long, etc. So articulation of goals and indicators, I think, are the starting points for any measurement system, and I think those are major challenges which people face.
And you're speaking about stakeholders in your organization, right?
Yes, I'm saying both, from both perspectives, right? Like even if you have, from both perspectives, internal organizational stakeholders as well as communities who are working with you, as well as then the other organizations who you're partnering with,
Right, amazing. Who else would like to share?
I think just the standardization, right? Like the sector we work in is like so dynamic and like contextual challenges or like differences to the T. How do you like even standardize across? I think coming up with a framework is easy, but is it effective across is something.
Like, you're not sure whether the framework is valid in itself.
Yes.
Yeah, very valid, yeah. Anybody else?
Creating generating the metrics is one thing. Whereas in the educational background, whereas we are working with the underserved students, where they are not comfortable writing and all. So we are solely dependent on the MCQs, and even sometimes as it is MCQs, kids are like so quick to just to fill it up. We face this practical challenges, whereas like we are still going up with the traditional way of taking the pre and post assessments, post survey, and also the video feedback and audio feedback or written feedback. Written is like so rare to get from the students. So practically we are facing the challenges to get the feedback from the beneficiaries.
Amazing. The data collection process itself is quite challenging for you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
For me personally, it has been defining indicators. So you can end up defining indicators, but once you have a standardized vision, let's say, how do you establish a connect between the indicator that you have defined and the vision? Like that connection building, validating that assumption basically that if we collect this indicator, we will be able to say that, okay, this goal is achieved. So that validating assumption is something that we struggle with.
I think especially when we look at collaboratives, right, and I think it flows from what you're saying, is also this attribution, right? Everyone wants to claim attribution, and now I think there is a direction towards contribution, and especially when we talk about collaboratives. But then one is attribution from a task to an outcome, but then it's also from a player, from a stakeholder to an outcome. So that becomes really challenging because everyone wants to say, this is my success story.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. All very, very valid challenges. Yeah. Maybe just go on a slide. Oh, it's up. It's up. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, we have the slides up. Yeah. I think I'll stand here so that I can see the slides. So thank you for sharing all the challenges because these are very valid challenges and we're going to speak about some of those in our presentation and hopefully we'll be able to navigate this together. Let's see how this works. Okay, so how does collective impact happen? All of us know that people come together for some reasons. And what are the characteristics of collective? And we'll be interchangeably using networks as well, the word network, but we do mean to say that people coming together. So it could be collective, it could be a network, and even in collectives you do have networks, right? So we'll be speaking about that in both the terms. So what are the characteristics of a collective? Is that a lot of stakeholders come together because they have a common understanding of the challenge that they're trying to solve and they have a common agenda to solve the problem. They want to come together to solve a very complex social problem. So having a shared agenda is very important for a collective. Then they have mutually reinforcing activities. Most of the collectives you'll see are formed because someone or the other is working on some part of the challenge that we're trying to solve, right? So therefore the activities are quite reinforcing. Then there's a continuous communication within the collective. It's a very clear and aligned communication to keep everybody intact in their road ahead on accessing the goal. Then there are shared measurement systems. Collectives always come together to solve a problem and therefore there has to be a shared measurement system. They should understand how to measure the impact of the work that they're doing in order to understand how to progress in their work as well as how to keep each other accountable. And then there has to be a backbone organization. So sometimes in collectives, there might not be a defined separate backbone organization, but some of the organization in the collective also might take up that responsibility where they would be responsible for keeping all the stakeholders coordinated and aligned. So that's called the backbone organization. So these are examples of different forms of collectives. We couldn't actually agree on how to put them together in a straight line basis on how structured or unstructured they are. So from whatever we understood, we thought this could be something where we could differentiate the organization, but this is not necessarily a very, very perfect kind of differentiation, where movements and informal networks, they are loose and voluntary networks which share information. So this is in contrast to a lot of networks that have a very, very defined structure and they have membership. So all the members follow a very, very predefined process and pattern to be a part of that collective. But in movements, you'll have seen that most of the movements, all the organizations that join the movement, they understand the shared goal, but they have their own responsibility of taking that work ahead. So that's quite different to how very, very organized networks are, like AVPN, where you have membership, you have a very defined structure, etc. These are two extremes, and then in between you have semi-formal networks and formalized networks. Now, why is measuring the impact of collectives important or even necessary in the first place? It's necessary because you need to track progress of your collective work that you're doing together, so that you know where you have reached in your goals, as well as you need to keep each other accountable. So that's the reason you need to have some kind of measurement. And then you don't need the measurement to report. You need the measurement so that you can use the data for continuous learning and improving, which is a very important thing to remember when you're measuring impact, that it's not the end goal, it's something which you require to continuously evolve your own program and progress. And then strengthening collaboration. When collectives, organizations come together to form a collective, they need to know how to understand collaborations, right? In order to strengthen them, to find out what's working and what's not. Whatever is working is something they can focus on so that the collaborations are deeper. And everybody is aligned in the pathway for the goal. And then increasing credibility and attracting support. It has been seen that most of the funders are more prone to funding initiatives that actually show evidence of progress. So that's the reason for your collective as well, you need to measure so that you can show it to the funder that this is a very impactful collective. Now, there are huge challenges in measuring the impact of collective. We just realized that even measuring impact of simple things is very difficult when it comes to social programs. Here we are speaking about complex programs because different stakeholders are coming together. So these are the challenges that you see. Why there are challenges is because there are many contributors and they have their own set of obligations on how they're contributing to the goal, and therefore we are looking at very dynamic impact pathways. It's not a straightforward impact pathway, and in collectives or in networks the impact happen in a chain reaction, right? You will have your organization's impact plus your organization has impact on your partner organization, and together you have impact on the ecosystem. So we are looking at very complex pathways. And then the data and methods both are again complex. Since the pathways are complex, getting the data for such kind of complex pathways is quite difficult. And then diverse priorities and views. I think somebody mentioned this, that the organization who are coming together may have different priorities on what they want to measure. And collectively, when they're creating the impact, they might have their own priority on what they want to see. And this is exactly where the attribution and contribution conundrum comes in place, where people think that I need to show attribution of my work even in the collaborative. Next, please. So we have a very simple framework on how we can look at the impact of a collective, a network, or a collaborative. And these are the pillars of the measurement, where we look at connectivity of a network, we look at the health of a network and the results of a network. By connectivity, we mean the connection between individuals and the organizations. Why it is important, we'll see in the forthcoming slides. And the health of the network, how vibrant your network is, what kind of resources are flowing through your network, and how sustainable your network is. If your collective is doing very impactful work, but if it is not sustainable, then you won't be having sustained impact. You'll have one impact at a point of time, and then no impact is happening because the collective will fall. And then results, the impact a network has in achieving the interim and the long-term goals. This framework will actually help you understand what kind of data you should be looking at while measuring the impact of a collective. So in terms of connectivity, there are sub-indicators such as membership and association of the collective. You need to understand the density of connections. That is, how many connections each stakeholder or a member of your collective is making, because the stronger the connection, the more the connection, the stronger is your collective's impact, because people are constantly learning from each other and they're working closer with each other. Therefore, the density of your connections is very important to understand. Then the diversity of expertise. In your collective, you need to have stakeholders that come from diverse expertise, so that wherever there are complex challenges, they can bring in their expertise to solve some part of that. So the more diverse your membership is, the chances are that you'll be able to learn and progress together faster. Then,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Though you have mentioned that these measures are subjective, but if you can give an example of what exactly defines as connections, like how do you measure connections? Because the interpretation of connections can be different for everyone. So what would be the indicator in order to
So as we've already mentioned, it's quite subjective. Depending on the nature of your work, you can actually decide how you want to define a connection here. For AVPN, for example, I can share this with you. One of the things is that we want to understand how one funder is connected to the other funder and how are they collaborating, because collaboration is what brings in the impact. Therefore, having more connection between the members of our network is very important for us.
Yeah. So I'll cover this a little bit in the how section and the methods. But for example, a survey to your members to say, currently as a baseline, right? How many of these other members do you work with? It can be loosely defined co-fund, formal, informal partnerships, right? Where you're kind of collaborating on a project together and so forth. And then see, 1 year later, 2 years later, is that increasing, decreasing? And so on. There are also softwares to do this, and I'll get into that. It's called the social network analysis. That really takes all this data and then can figure out, okay, who are the key influencers that are most collaborating with the most number of members? Are there gaps in the types of organizations that are left behind? Or where you have seen high points of collaboration and then it certainly dips and so on, where you use kind of data from public sources as well as internal data to figure this out. But at the basics, a quick survey basically that asks the smart questions can help you get a sense of this connectivity.
Yeah. And in terms of structure, what kind of resources are flowing through your network is very important. People come into collaboratives not only because the parent organization or the backbone organization is bringing them together. They come because they do want to work with the rest of the stakeholders in a collective, because there's always something they can exchange. And when we say resources, it could be any kind of resources, be it intellectual, knowledge resource, financial resource, where they could collaborate in.
And the reason why we say the connectivity is a subjective thing, because as Kavita mentioned earlier, for example, Shikshagraha is a movement and it's informal and it's designed from any teacher or on-ground stakeholder all the way to a funder or formal sort of organization to be a member. And therefore, the density score per member may be low. But here you're going for breadth, right? And you're trying to get more people to feel like they're part of this movement and do some few things together and exchange knowledge, micro innovations and so forth. Versus an AVPN where their members pay a lot of times membership fees and so forth, in which case you are actually trying to get those who are formally in that to collaborate a lot more. So then your expectation for that density and the centrality node, all of that is much higher. But then you're trying to keep it a bit more contained, but then high level of collaboration within that, versus a movement where it's less formal, and then the goal is not necessarily to get a lot of collaboration per every member, but breadth.
Next slide.
Sorry, where did the clicker go? Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So the next construct is health. So the health of the collective is very important. For example, the resources. The resources meaning the resources that are required for the sustainability of the collective itself. So we need to be very sure that the collective will be sustainable for a longer period of time. So that is a huge part of the impact as well. Your impact can only be created if your collective actually survives. So that's the thing. And the budget efficiency. The kind of funds you get and the kind of funds that are used in administrative purposes versus the programs that you're supporting, that efficiency is very important. It shouldn't be that your collective's admin costs are very high and therefore you have very small budget to then spend on the work that's going to create impact. And the infrastructure, you need to have processes in place for the whole collective to function properly, for the communications that happen, for how they're going to utilize the resources in the collective, etc. There have to be good processes. So that's something which is very important, because based on all of these processes, it will be decided on how effective your collective is. Meaning, if decision making is going to be very difficult because there are no processes in place, your collective will again fall. There has to be a lower time for decision making in a collective. It cannot be that there are 1,000 people in a collective and therefore the decision has to be made by, has to be ratified by 1,000 people, and it's a very vertically aligned process. And then advantage, that is the member contribution rate. How many stakeholders in your collective are actively contributing to the work of your collective? That's a very important way to understand how vibrant your collective is. A lot of collectives fall through because people take up membership, but then they don't do anything in the collective. So then there's 1 or 2 members in the collective that are working, and then that's not going to be a very impactful collective. So finding out the member contribution rate is very important in a collective. And then cross-sector collaborations. As we saw that we require a very, very diverse range of people to form a collective, we need to see how they are collaborating within themselves as well. It's not that they only come for the collective, but have they actually collaborated within themselves to create a force for the impact of the collective. I'll pass it on to Dayong.
Thanks, Kavita. So moving on to what to measure in terms of the actual results, right, of your collaborative initiative. It can be at the individual level, and I think a lot of the questions a small group of us earlier were discussing is, even at the per child level, if the child doesn't know how to write, how can you really get the right input on his or her learning levels, for example? Right? And there are even more complex things other than foundational literacy and numeracy, for which there are some standardized tests, EGRA, EGMA, you may have heard of these things, that have been validated world over, that are cheap, ASR, and so on. But social-emotional learning, life skills, right? There have been, of course, some measures, but far less agreement in the field on what is the right metric, and is it best suited for this type of community and cultural context and so forth. But we are seeing increasingly tools and collaborative efforts, for example, the Life Skills Collaborative, that Dream a Dream and others, some of you may be in the room, are working on, and the LSAS, Life Skills Assessment Scale and so forth, that are localized to the Indian context and so forth. So a lot of it exists, but really picking out, okay, if your collaborative actually even is working at that individual level, because many collaboratives are actually working at the systems level, right? AVPN is an example where you're not necessarily going to track what is the improvement on the FLN, foundation literacy of a child, but we'll be looking at the structural, relational, salience building elements of an ecosystem, of a funding ecosystem, for example. Has the initiative been able to make policy and regulatory shifts? For example, in the social emotional learning space, elevate the importance on, let's say, NEP and key policy documents and discussions, schemes, funding and mobilizing resources towards that space, the accountability structures that exist, let's say in the government officials, do they actually care about foundational literacy and numeracy, or is it just there is Nippon but actually doesn't translate to anyone's KPIs? Are there well-discovered knowledge and best practices in that system that has the evidence base of what works and what doesn't? There are some systems where we know there's been lots of rigorous studies and this is how change happens. Teaching at the right level works and so on. But there are other more nascent fields where that's less known, right? And so the maturity of the sector's knowledge on what works and what doesn't can be a result that an initiative, collaborative initiative, is looking for. Relational, this goes back to Kavita's point around the health of the collaborative as well, but the number and diversity of not only the official members of that initiative, but organizations, civil society organizations that are working, let's say, on mental health space. You're tracking that over time, and your network may be only 5 entities, but you're trying to ripple out the importance of this, talk about it, get others to inspire to then take up this mandate, right? And the partnerships and collaboration, again, outside of just your membership, thinking about the broader sectoral partnerships and collaboration. And then, how do you influence societal beliefs and practices? Is this actually important to the parent, for example, FLN? Do people care about thriving in social emotional learning, or do they think the school system is all about academic learning? For example, have these beliefs changed? And often we see collaboratives looking for these more systems level impact indicators as their measures of success versus, let's say, very individual sort of child or youth level indicators. Now going on to the question of how to measure, and again, because the systemic change is often not a direct attribution of one organization or entity, but by definition, it is a system that's dynamic and many actors are working towards it. So measuring contribution becomes important. And the rate or trajectory of that impact. So policy change can be binary, but there's a lot that happens in order to, let's say, get something like social emotional learning recognized and have budgets against it in the policy document. So what is almost the rate that at which that change is happening? For example, philanthropic funding going into a particular area. Maybe 1 year is an anomaly, but looking at the time trend over time, is it incrementally increasing or actually significantly increasing? For example, in education space, we've actually seen it incrementally increasing versus climate change has been actually increasing quite a lot more. Now with US government pulling out of climate commitments globally, we might see the ripple effects, right? But then you can see not the only absolute amount mobilized, but the rate of change at the systems level becomes more important to focus on. Sentiment to act. Again, some of the systemic change takes a lot of time, but you will see the signals of, do people actually care? Let's say funders are putting out in their press releases that they're going to be looking at funding these areas and so forth. So if you're looking at resource mobilization, not only looking at how much money was mobilized, but are people talking about this with resources? And the influence that you have on the most influential actors in the system. So for example, the number of high-level decision makers citing the network's recommendations and insights in policy documents, funding priority documents, and so forth, to say, this is my measure of influence in the ecosystem. Not that I changed it. I may not have gotten the $2 billion bill passed as an organization myself, but I know that my research was cited in a hearing that was really critical, in a consultation where the key decision makers were referencing heavily. Yeah.
Just a little add-on, and maybe I missed this, but so I get the individual and the system, right? But I think there's probably a missing piece of the organization level impacts. Yes. Yeah, like how do you, because even if I'm like, running an organization and I join an AVPN or any other collaborative, of course there I'm looking at, the individual impacts that I'm having, but at the end of the day, my organization also has certain levels of impacts, right? Like I change the way I do things or my practice, and then that kind of comes down to the systems level because then multiple organizations are taking that change, method, approach, all of that, right? So any reason why you're left out the organization level because there is one, right?
Yeah, so I think you're saying almost a theory of change of a collective is that as the collective network of folks like AVPN, you are essentially empowering your members who are then empowering or who are then making the change. So we've talked about the network and change directly, but then there is the network's impact also on the organization, right? Which then of course, and that is a soft measure to say all those things that Kavita talked about, like are members actually collaborating? Are decisions being made efficiently so it doesn't take a million years to align?
So you're assuming that members are representative of...
Exactly, yeah. And so if your network is well functioning, you have a lot of members benefiting from that connection. So it's not the individual sum of parts, but it's the individual parts, but the sum of the whole is actually bigger, right? So because we're trying to measure the collaborative's impact. And of course, you also aggregate your members' impact. That's very important. So all the organizations that are working, but then your claim to fame, if you will, your contribution it's like what difference did you make because of your structures that allow for that collaborative space. Yeah. And so I think the methods are pretty common. You all know it. You want to do surveys, let's say, of the partner organizations, the member organizations, staff, the stakeholders, which gets you broad reach, like quantifiable trends, but it's only limited, right? Then you also want to have some conversations, one-to-one interviews, focus group discussions for much richer, more nuanced, context-driven insights, and can capture some of the unintended consequences of the work as well. And then document review, often easier and cheaper to obtain if it's publicly available, like policy documents, legislative hearings, and consultation notes, annual reports, funding databases, press releases, partner organizations' own individual reports and evaluations, and aggregating that and seeing if some of the funding sources have been due to collaborative impact, what amount of the work that each organization is doing is actually in collaboration with other members, and so forth. From an analysis point of view, we just wanted to highlight, and this gets a little bit technical, but a few, I think, interesting methods. You all have, I think, talked about how do you measure this connectivity and health of a network. And there are ways to do this using software as well, but also you can do it manually, where you map and measure the relationships in that network, right? And with a few organizations, obviously, it's easier to do manually, to say, okay, do interviews and surveys and figure out who's connected to what are all the different collaborations. Is it on a relative scale of 1 to 10, low level of collaboration or high level of collaboration, getting perceptions on members' own understanding of that collaboration quotient and so forth, and the flow of information. But again, with the help of now technology, you can look at communication patterns across organizations, how much they're cross-referencing each other in the press releases and the impact reports and the documents that they're putting out in their social media handles and so forth through technology to map out. Earlier what Kavita mentioned around the connectivity and health of a network. Results, there are a few interesting ones. So the most common ones that we've used are qualitative methods, basically. One called process tracing, and the other called outcomes harvesting. So technical terms, but basically it's, to simplify it, process tracing is more forward-looking. You look at what are the big activities that your initiative has been doing, and then follow it through. Okay, so we held a knowledge seminar and funded a few knowledge pieces around evidence generation of best practices in foundation literacy numeracy. What did that do that influenced then this policy and so forth? And to say, track the process of your activities to then outcomes, to say you contributed as an initiative to these outcomes. Outcomes harvesting is starting actually with the outcomes. Let's look at the NEP and trace backwards what were the pivotal moments in the NEP's journey, the National Education Policy, to say what consultations were most pivotal. Who were the key voices in the room that talked about social emotional learning or computational thinking or whatever that you're trying to measure? And was there a fingerprint of your collaborative's impact in that outcome? So both process tracing, starting from your activities and thinking about where it ended up and how much impact did that create, and then outcomes harvesting, starting from the outcomes themselves that you're seeing in the field and seeing if you can detective work, see that fingerprint of your initiative's impact. Sentiment analysis, I was talking to the Apprentice Project folks earlier, where you're mining essentially the chatter online, public discourse, whether it's Twitter or public documents that are available on this topic, even the NEP, people talking about it. And you can code some positive sentiment words, negative sentiment words. For example, diversity, equity, inclusion. Perhaps in the last few months, that's been gaining a lot more chatter, but some of it has been backlash and negative coming from, let's say, the US government deprioritizing DEI and so on. So you'll be able to tell through smart sentiment analysis, hey, the sentiment to act on DEI, maybe there's a lot more dialogue in that in the last few months, but it's been negative dialogue. There's backlash against it and so on. So this whole idea of how do you measure public salience around an issue, if you're an ecosystem sort of builder, you can now do this to, let's say, advocacy efforts, after key kind of events and things like that, using machine learning, natural language processing models and techniques for fairly inexpensively. And just to end, I know we are exactly at time, I believe, to our original schedule, Rucha, but do we have a little extra time? We have half an hour. Okay, got it. Yeah, and so this social network analysis, there's an organization called the Sustainable Favela Network in Brazil. I think there were some speakers in the keynote talking about the Amazon River and so on. And this one was a network of almost 180 different favelas, and they mapped all the different initiatives across the different favelas and their leaders and how are they collaborating, and figured out here are the nodes on specific topic areas where there's a lot more work, like wash and sanitation. Education, not as much collaboration. And geographically also to say, these are the areas where there's a lot of collaborative activity and there's missing pieces in the south or whatever that is. In Dahlberg, we've done sentiment analysis, to understand a climate initiative's advocacy portfolio to see if they've actually changed the perception around climate change after, let's say putting $1 million campaign into the ecosystem. And some of this you want to be smart around which community do you want to influence. If it's global and you're making a very small little video that goes to these only small communities, you're not gonna pick up the sentiment of change at a global level, right? But you want to target the audience that you're actually trying to influence and then run these types of analysis, and that can be quite helpful. I think just ending with this example, which was a collaborative here in India on youth well-being, and the collaborative was really formed to address the fragmentation. Lots of different organizations, some working on ending early child marriage, on sexual reproductive health and mental well-being, not a lot of collaboration. So boosting visibility on the importance of working across sector when it comes to youth well-being. Driving more funding and coordinated funding was the goal of this collaborative. So we looked at just a few indicators. Number of new connections that this collaborative catalyze. How many new funders are you able to bring to this space? Then was there effective collaboration within the partner NGOs? And what was the sentiment to act in terms of the shift in the attitudes on whether the communities or the organizations that are working in this space actually care about youth well-being in general? And some of the finding was that the collaborative actually did quite a good job in bringing new funders who previously did not care about or was funding adjacent spaces, maybe core academic learning, but not holistic well-being of youth and so on. But through our analysis, we surfaced that a lot of the funders were still funding very narrowly, very specific initiatives around the specific geographies that fit with their mandates. And it was still a siloed approach under one umbrella, but not a lot of collaboration amongst the NGOs, and very few donors who are willing to fund flexibly. It was still like, I want to fund this particular program that fits with this strategy. So while new funders have come on board, the collaboration across the NGOs and amongst the funders existed at a nominal level, but when you peel the layers, it was still very sort of mapping one-to-one in terms of specific things that they wanted to fund and so forth. So our recommendation led to changes in really highlighting the partner synergies, as well as tracking more platform level metrics. So this is an example of they were actually doing a great job aggregating all the different member organizations' specific impact and saying this is the whole impact that our members created, but not saying what is the impact that this collaborative platform has created differently and above and beyond what individual organizations were doing anyways. So that platform level collaboration metric is something that we helped essentially make it much more clear, and an annual quick survey to the member organizations to ask the right questions to understand how this is changing and actively measuring the improvements and managing that over time. So otherwise, what you don't measure, it's hard to manage and doesn't get improved. Right? And so that's the end of the presentation segment, and we had earlier about 45 minutes, but I think now maybe 25 minutes for this segment, but hopefully it's still okay. Yeah, Kavita, you want to come? Yeah, so firstly, before maybe moving on, any questions on anything that we discussed? Because it's a relatively small group, we'd love to just make it as relevant to you all as possible.
I'm curious to understand a little bit more about sentiments analysis. And I don't come from this background, so it's all very new for me. So yeah, I'm just wondering, how do you measure the effectiveness of the same as well, since people might have different opinions about the same issue? So how would that go? Like how dialectical or how objective could you get in that as well?
Yeah, so it is as objective as you code it to be, but basically it is an AI and machine learning driven methodology that you scrape the internet and you get all the relevant sources of, with deep research and tools like that exist. I think the cost of doing something like this is getting only lower and lower. But public forums, right? We said social media, platforms of institutions and individuals, basically tag all of the spaces that we think are relevant. And then you have almost a dictionary that says, here are the positive sentiment words, negative sentiment words, and combination of words and terms. And you feed it and then let the basically algorithm run. And then you'll have to test it to see if it's accurate, to what extent this makes sense with a small set of data, and then expand it. But then be able to actually use that to say, hey, let's roughly speaking, the amount of time social emotional learning and derivative and related terms are showing up in the ether or in the social media sphere and public discourse has increased significantly. But maybe in terms of DEI, as I said, a lot of that recent times has been backlash or negative. So you'll get a sense of, are people talking about it more? How much more? What is the rate or trajectory of change? As well as the positive or negative, or what's the sentiment, right? And a lot of times, brands do this really well. So for example, Coca-Cola or McDonald's or whatever it is, right? Unilever, to say, okay, like, what is the sentiment of my brand in the online space? And you can do, of course, user surveys and things like that in addition to create new data, but at least in the existing data. And what are the words associated, right? People have a positive perception of Coca-Cola or whatever versus negative or neutral, and how does that change over time? What is my brand perception? So similarly, what is the perception around a certain issue like climate change or even social emotional learning, neutral to no one cares, or a lot of people care, more people are caring, and there's a lot of interest. I hope that helps a little bit.
I think these tools should be more used not for evaluation as an end goal, but for constantly learning and improving. Because then you have an option that you see the sentiments, and if there are some negative sentiments that you're seeing, you need to focus on improving that part.
To the place where, and 100% agree, right? It's not a proving game, it's an improving game. But, and just where we have the two levels, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah. She has a Yeah, I do it. Yeah, so I'm just thinking, right? Like when we started with indicators earlier, they were a little bit more sort of objective, right? Like percentages, and relational kind of is similar to what we spoke on the slide before. But exactly that problem, like you'd asked, right, is societal beliefs and practices. While we can use sentiment analysis, honestly, again, there are so many players in that space, like even stakeholders or even in a government sort of in a system, there are different players. So then, how do you tap into those kind of things? And is it just by default the nature of indicators that the more you go into systems level, the more subjective they become in your experience? Just like to hear a little bit about that, right? Because when you start talking individuals, organizations, very simple. And then it always goes like this. So just your thoughts, your experience on that.
I can take a stab on that because our work is majorly at a systems level. So measuring impact at a systems level is quite difficult because, as we mentioned, the attribution is very difficult, right? You have some programs that you're running. You know the impact pathways for that, but that program also has many other stakeholders influencing it. So if you see an impact happening, you can't actually say that it happened because of me. There's no direct causal pathway for that. And therefore, the best way to address that is to say, for this impact, this was our contribution. My program had this contribution. When you're trying to see overall impact at a systemic level, and when you're trying to see the contribution, since there's no counterfactual there, you need to have a lot of data on the landscape to see what was there earlier and then what was the contribution that your program brought in for you to actually even say at a systems level, this is the contribution of my organization. So, yeah, or a collaborative. So it's quite complex, and at the same time, it's also very expensive because sometimes you might not have the landscape data with you. So you're looking at a very big landscape because this is a systems level problem you're solving. So you need to be looking at all of those indicators at the systems level, saying this is the data which was there earlier, and now we see the incremental change that has happened, and that is because of the collective efforts of our collaborative.
Yeah, so far more complex, but I think let perfect not be the enemy of good. It's still better to try and get a rough sense than say, oh, give up, this is too complex, you can never measure it, right? So I think that's the point. Sentiment, and again, it's imperfect. Those who are online are a certain group, elite, privileged, have access to the internet, can type and write, and you leave out the masses. But there are other ways, a voting issue is foundational literacy and numeracy a voting issue today? Probably not. You can probably run public opinion polls on WhatsApp and things like that to generate new data. But this is still, one way to get some information.
For any systems level impact, it's not necessary that you have a perfect indicator for evaluation. As long as you can measure the progress of the impact of your goal, it's still good because you can at least see the incremental changes happening. That's still fine. And systemic changes or system level impact takes a long time to happen. So maybe even in our lifetime we might not be able to see. So we shouldn't get stuck that we are unable to prove that our collective did the systems level impact. As long as we can say that there was progress that our collective brought through, it's still progress and it's still a win.
Great. So we now have about, I think, 15 minutes. So earlier we had brainstormed a breakout group where we're getting in small groups and actually have you guys practice this thing in terms of with your own collaborative initiative, thinking about what are the big goals, picking maybe 2 or 3 of the most important goals and thinking about what metrics do you want to measure, and then how might you measure that, whether it's a survey tool or sentiment analysis interesting or outcomes harvesting and so on. But that was supposed to be a 45-minute overall segment, and now we have 15 minutes. So wondering maybe, Rucha, should we shift the format a little bit? Do maybe take a couple more questions and then move to takeaways and wrap? Yeah. Any other questions or maybe reflections on what was most useful, what's still on your mind?
I would like to understand, is there any specialization or the course that I can attend like for the impact analysis, for better impact analysis for myself and my organization level?
Yeah. So I'm not aware of anything on collective impact measurement. But there are a lot on impact measurement in general. I think JPAL has a course that,
You have it on Coursera and edX both. So just look at, and that's actually a certification course where you have to do some of the quizzes, the assignments, etc. And that certification is called a mini masters. So micro masters. So if you plan somewhere in the future to go to the US to study, those credits are actually usable there.
yeah, go for it.
I think for solutions which are like, say, indigenous products,
Yeah.
I was just trying to think of an example for this, but I couldn't. So in the case of, say, indigenous products or indigenous art forms, for example, when you're trying to measure, right, things like impact and penetration, it's a little difficult because there isn't enough decolonial, perhaps, language or non-numeric measures. So do either of you have any advice for how to approach those kinds of interventions?
Yeah. So again, from TAP, I don't know, did you want to talk about Bashni and how you guys are trying to use AI to basically translate into indigenous languages and do some measurement there?
Hi, thanks for that, Dayang. So I work the app in this project. It's called TAP. It's so you have a chatbot. It's an AI-enabled WhatsApp chatbot, and we have students from across the country speaking to the chatbot, right, across 10 states. Now this issue comes up where the student is speaking a certain language and the chatbot, generally, I mean, it's embedded with ChatGPT, so it gives a response in English. So we've embedded Bhashini, which is a tool, a multilingual support tool, and every time the student speaks in a certain language, even via voice or via text, Bhashini is going to translate that, and then ChatGPT sort of processes it. ChatGPT brings it back to Bhashini, Bhashini again translates, and the student gets the response in the language in which he asked the question. So multilingual support, you can embed tools that will help. I don't know if this was exactly your question, but this is what...
Yeah, this is what I called you for. So I think one of them is just language diversity in the country, especially indigenous languages. It's not 10, 20, but like thousands. So that's, I think, the technology more about instead of like manually having to translate and then to really understand, I think, common measurement. Thank you. Lowering the cost using some of these tools like Bashni. But I think the other piece is to find what is the right metric for success for that community. And I think with some of you, we were having participatory kind of design of outcomes, not by funder mandates, but by what does a parent want for that child. May not be to go to the best university in Delhi, but maybe to actually, have a thriving livelihood within the community and so forth. What is a child's ambition and so on? So actually centering the evaluation through participatory research, asking the so-called beneficiaries, right, but the users of our products and services and programs, what success looks like for them, and then seeing how it's meeting their goals to get more contextual and culturally relevant outcomes is something else that we see. But again, probably more at that individual community level change. Yeah. Final question.
Even for collective, when you're looking at a collective impact, that has to be a participatory process, right? When you're defining your outcomes also, that needs to be known by all. It can't be measured by whoever is measuring and saying that, yes, right? Absolutely. Especially when it comes to collective, I was just saying when you're looking at impact and at the collective level, so that also has to be a participatory process, where you're defining the outcomes as a collective. Yeah, and it is then only that you can actually measure the that. Yeah,
absolutely. And so at Dalberg, we're just designing and about to launch this personalized adaptive learning EdTech collaborative, and it has some players that are doing in-school solutions in academic learning. There are others like the Apprentice Project that are at home or community-based outside of school, but also extracurriculars and targeting 21st century skills. And so it is all personalized and adaptive underlying technology, and we as a collaborative is threaded. The common agenda is to get the technologies that we believe really work into the hands of as many students as possible. But for TAP, the end goal is 21st century skills. For educational initiatives, MindSpark is, let's say, academic learning, like literacy and numeracy skills and so on. So in some sense, each member may also have different goals. What we looked at as a goal for the collaborative is, well, it's almost the lowest common denominator. Maybe that's a little bit kind of making it too simple, but the connected agenda, which is that this personalized way of learning through technology is scaled and in the hands of the students in low-income communities. So we're tracking that agnostic to, is it 21st century skills or academic learning and so on. But we have co-created that shared agenda, and we talked a lot about membership. Should we narrow it down to focus specifically on academic learning, or should we keep it intentionally wide? Should we keep it to also other forms of effective ed tech that's not personalized but highly sort of gamified and interactive and so forth? And so I think it's also up to really define that really well in a way that connects all the members or the contributors of that initiative. But of course also each will have some flavor of change, and I think Kavita talked about the, therefore, diversity of priorities and figuring out what is that common thing that everyone's behind for this collaborative is important. But yeah, defining that in a participatory way, of course, matters, because it's a shared agenda. Anything else to add?
No, I think you covered it. Without mic, it's good, right? I think for that. While I understand that technology is like rapidly catching up to all the areas of social programs, but these qualitative analysis that you talked about, outcome harvesting, like this can be done in a rigorous way because it is more about the actions leading to a particular outcome.
Yes.
But when it comes to behavioral or attitudinal change, sentiment analysis or maybe social network analysis is something that you would want to do, which requires technology, but not everyone has that access. So are there ways to do such analysis which are not heavily based on technology? Because we don't have access to that. And we want to do that qualitative analysis.
Yeah. I think outcomes harvesting is quite easy.
That I understand, and it's very activity oriented.
Yeah. And sentiment analysis, of course, requires, in case you have a lot to evaluate, analyze, you will need a software, because if there are less number of data points that you're looking at, then it's easy to do it manually. But as Jaya mentioned, if you're looking at thousands and lakhs of data points,
it's better to utilize a software, because then the calculations happen easily and the results are very easily shared with you. Otherwise, imagine you'll be completely going through.
But I would say there are easier versions of this that's freely available. Media mentions. I think Google Analytics can do this for you, right? The number of times a certain term shows up. So this may not get you is it in a positive or negative way? What are the pair terms with it? But at least are more people talking about it or fewer people talking about it over the years? Similarly, as I mentioned, the connectivity, you can just do a member survey and say, how many people are you working with? And what was the role of this as a result of being an AVPN? Are you much more likely to collaborate with others? Somewhat more likely? Not at all, it's the same, it didn't make a difference, right? So there are these other easier ways, low cost survey tools.
I mean, maybe very different, and of course it's all subjective, and I love that that's there. But, you know, so usually you look at the effectiveness of a collaborative, right? What you have right now in terms of, or what you had in the health, right? So that's the effectiveness of how strong your collaboration is. But then when you look at the impact pieces, then it's, I mean, that's how we would, like even what you have in individual, right? Like the way access and equity, all of those are also system level changes. Because, so, you know, just thinking about it like that, so you have your impacts, but individual level also goes down into systems then, and then you can track impact of the collaborative on the professional, on the organization, and then on the system, and the system has two prongs, right? The system, one prong would be your actual social impact, so to speak, which is your individual level, and then is your, you know, like what has it driven, mindsets, all of that. So yeah, I'm just wrapping my head and love that there's another, you know, kind of way of thinking it, but just my thoughts on how, you know, effectiveness, health, all of that works, but just why is individual different from systems, because it is exactly what the end goal is then, you know. So that's my final thoughts on that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess it's more about, practically speaking, how would you measure? Because measuring the learning level of a child, the tools are different.
Or do we have the resources to even do
yeah?
that?
Or do we even need to? Like a VPN, as I said, would never need, want to measure because it's quite indirect, right? And they're so diverse. It's not even one, it's not education only. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. I know it's a long session and very hot, unfortunately.